Just wait one more minute.
Good.
Mhm.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Making Connections and Sharing Lessons from Campaigns to Build Communities, Not Cop Shops and Cages. My name is Justin Pichet, and I'm a full professor in the Department of Criminology at the University of Ottawa, which is located on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. A bit about me. I recently co-authored How to Abolish Prisons, Lessons from the Movement Against Imprisonment with Rachel Herzing. And although it's not officially out, apparently it's starting to show up at people's houses. So if you haven't already, please consider ordering a copy and also check out our free study guide here via Haymarket. I'll quickly add that I am a member of the Criminalization and Punishment Education Project. We ran the NOPE campaign, No Ottawa Prison Expansion, from 2017 to 2020 to stop a $1 billion jail from being built in Ottawa. And for the past 3.5 years, CPEP has been part of what you see here on the screen, the Coalition Against the Proposed Prison, which is running a campaign to stop a new $500 million prison from being built on the grounds of the former Kentville Agricultural College Farm, which includes prime agricultural land, floodplain, and a creek, the kinds of things we may want to keep in an age of climate catastrophe and food insecurity. I'll be moderating the event today. Before I go any further, I think it's important to note that this session was originally scheduled to take place on Saturday, November 4th, as part of the 2023 annual meeting of the American Studies Association in Montreal. And Montreal is situated on the traditional territory of the Kanakahaka Nation. And our panel, however, didn't take place that day because those of us in Montreal participated in the ASA Gaza walkout that joined a local rally in Montreal that drew tens of thousands of people demanding an end to several decades of occupation and apartheid in Palestine and an end to the latest wave of genocidal violence Israel has unleashed in Gaza following the October 7th attacks by Hamas that killed over 1,000 human beings. November 4th, there was a lot of hope in the air that day in the streets of Montreal. And I think months later, it's hard to think that tens of thousands of Palestinians, including scores of children, have died since that day, and that the deaths and the suffering continue, as the military-industrial complex marches forward and brings peace to no one. And I think all of us here understand that decolonial and decarceral struggles, which are fundamentally about the liberation of all people, and freeing land from capitalist death machines that are killing us and our planet. These struggles are intertwined, and we must continue to demand and fight for a better world than the one we have today, both for ourselves and for generations to come. And so with this said, we'll turn our attention now to what brings us together today. As our preamble in the handout for this session notes, it's undeniable. Policing and imprisonment kills. So for instance, in Canada alone, it's a country of 40 million people. There have been at least 748 police-involved deaths where force was used, and at least 1,581 deaths in custody since 2000, according to trackinginjustice.ca, which you see here on the screen. It's also undeniable that communities targeted by carceral state violence have had enough and are organizing to choose real safety and work towards decarceral futures where the needs of all of us are met and transformative justice is practiced in the wake of violence. So for instance, Robin Maynard and other members of the Abolition Coalition launched the Choosing Real Safety Declaration in 2021 to rally people and organizations around the idea of defunding, dismantling, and building alternatives to policing and imprisonment in Canada. There's also groups like Escaping Tomorrow's Cages in Ontario, and CAPE, the Coalition Against Prison Expansion in New Brunswick. They're running prison construction moratorium campaigns in this country. Incidentally, CAPE is also the acronym for Community Action on Prison Expansion, which is organizing against carceral expansion in the UK. But yet, amid increasingly mainstream calls and organizing to defund the police and abolish prisons, carceral state institutions, entities continue to push for more funds and resources, and governments are giving it to them, including for new policing and prison infrastructure. And again, from where I'm sitting in Canada, a forthcoming peer-reviewed paper in Criminologie, a French academic journal, that I co-authored with my doctoral students, Olivia Gemma, Mackenzie Plum, and Liz Vexel, documents roughly 17 prison infrastructure projects pegged to cost over $3 billion that are at various stages of completion that are going to add, if they're not stopped, 2,000 beds in the country that imprisons close to 35,000 people. So there's a bit of a difference, obviously, in scale and scope of prison construction between Canada and, say, the United States, that has, roughly 7 times the rate of imprisonment that we do. Nonetheless, these are troubling trends and they need to stop. We're working to stop them. And this roundtable aims to share lessons learned from campaigns to build communities, not cop shops and cages, to seed the ground for future abolitionist organizing. So let me introduce today's speakers. So I'll start first with Mika Herskind, who's an organizer, writer, and law student involved in movements against police and jail expansion. He is a co-editor of a forthcoming book, No Cop City, No Cop World, writing from the Stop Cop City movement, Haymarket Books 2025. So welcome to Micah. We also have Jordan Mazurek, who's a facilitator, trainer, and strategist that's built campaigns and coalitions with grassroots communities across the South that have defeated over $5 billion worth of new prison construction. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say. We also have Jack Norton. Jack is assistant professor of criminal justice at Governor State University in the Chicago Southland. He is co-editor of The Jail is Everywhere, Fighting the New Geography of Mass Incarceration with Verso. We also have Judah Shept, who's a full prof of justice studies at Eastern Kentucky University, who researches and organizes against prison construction in Central Appalachia. He is author, I should say, of Coal, Cages Crisis, The Rise of the Prison Economy in Central Appalachia, and a co-editor of the recently released The Jail is Everywhere, Fighting the New Geography of Mass Incarceration. We also have Nicole Siegel, who is a full professor of American Studies and History at Indiana University, Bloomington, a longtime member of Critical Resistance, and a founding member of Decarcerate Monroe County. She is currently working to chart the flows of finance through the family policing system in Indiana and beyond, while also organizing to prevent local jail expansion in Bloomington. And joining Nicole, we also have Lee Grunfolder, who's a member of CARE, Not Cages. So we have quite the lineup of folks here to share their knowledge with you all. And then after we're done about 2 rounds of questions with this roundtable, we're going to open up questions to the audience. So sit tight. Between now and 3 p.m. Eastern time, we're going to cover a lot of ground, and I'll stop sharing my screen. There we go. Did I plug enough stuff? I think I did. All right, so let's get to the first question. First question, we're going to go in alphabetical order, and we'll go in reverse order for the second round. What is the state of carceral expansion in the context in which you're organizing? So like what's going on in terms of perhaps increases in police and prison infrastructure and other things that you think are noteworthy to note right now. So we'll start first with Micah. You're up.
Great. Well, hello, everyone. Great to be here on this call with so many people that I look up to and have learned a lot from. And thank you to everyone who was involved in organizing this. So I mostly feel like I have depressing things to say for this first question because the state of carceral expansion is very bleak. I have been organizing in Atlanta for the last 4 years, although I'm actually currently out of Atlanta doing law school. And just want to say from the start that some of the movements I've been involved with have been the movement to close and transform the Atlanta City Jail into a community resource center. And then, of course, the movement to stop Cop City. And both of those movements are made up of hundreds and thousands of people who have been in the streets, who have been knocking doors, who have been in City Hall, who have been taking direct action. And so honored to be here as one representative of a very decentralized and diverse group. So the state of carceral expansion in Atlanta and Georgia, I have two just quick points that I want to make. First is that I think it's really an all-out assault. It's a assault on all fronts is what it feels like right now in Atlanta. So just to like run the list of a couple, there's of course Cop City, which hopefully folks have heard about, but it is this proposal sort of put forward by Atlanta's ruling class actors to take hundreds of acres of forest land in Southeast Atlanta in a majority Black working class area and to turn it into this massive $120 million police militarization facility. It's called Cop City because it literally includes plans for a mock sort of pretend city block in it, which, continues on from Chicago's Cop Academy. We're seeing, these proposals for cop cities spring up all over the place with, varying details. And so probably if you've heard of things coming out of Atlanta, that's the one, the thing that you've heard about. But at the same time, I think it's really important to note that Cop City is far from the only sort of form of carceral expansion in Atlanta. So just to name a couple others, there is a jail called the Atlanta City Detention Center that was built in the 90s in preparation for the 1996 Olympics held in Atlanta. And back in 2019, after a big campaign led by formerly incarcerated women of color with Women on the Rise, the city had actually promised to close down that jail and transform it into a community resource center. It was this really sort of beautiful abolitionist campaign to say, close the jails, build, community resources. And a couple of years after that promise was made, it was officially reversed. And the new mayor who came into office, Andre Dickens, picked up on his predecessor, Keisha Lance Bottom's apathy and basically reversed that promise and not only kept the jail open, but actually entered into a lease agreement with Fulton County in Atlanta to actually put more people in that jail. So we have Cop City, we have the local city jail. At the same time, we have the Fulton County Jail, which is, just an absolute place of death and suffering, and currently sort of under the guise of carceral humanism and the fact that so many people have been, murdered there by the jail itself. They are now the county commission is proposing a new $2 billion jail. At the same time, at the state level, there's been a lot of sort of cohesion between city and state. They have actually also at the local level, they have, after doing some bail reform, both state and locally in the 2010s, they have now for the last 3 years in a row at the state level rolled back bail reform. They've rolled back bail reform at the city level. We've, of course, saw the reversal of this promise to close the jail. They are attacking the infrastructure of movements. So the Atlanta Solidarity Fund is a bail fund that has, bailed out a lot of folks and helped get legal representation for criminalized protesters. And the Georgia legislature just passed a bill this year to basically outlaw bail funds in the state, following other states that have done similarly. And so, yeah, it's an all-out assault of carceral expansion. And that sort of brings me to the second point. And I swear in the second question of this panel, I have more hopeful things to say, is that it's deeply bipartisan. And that, we're seeing this like deep synergy between the Democrat-led city of Atlanta, majority Black city council, Black mayor, and the really right-wing governor, Brian Kemp, and the Attorney General, Chris Carr of Georgia, and the Republican-led legislature to really, push forward these attacks on movements and these attacks on people. And it's interesting because you see, a different gloss from each of them, sort of their own versions of law and order. Of course, the right wingers are seizing, on the crime narratives, crime is out of control, these Antifa leftists are out of control, we're going to pass bills, they just passed a bill, I think yesterday, actually, they finally got it through, to basically legalize running over protesters. It's so that's sort of the Republican side. And the Democrats are doing the exact same thing, but just with different talking points. They're on board with all these rollbacks. The rollbacks to bail reform started at the local level, in Georgia. Of course, the talking points there are, oh, well, you were in the streets in 2020 and you said you wanted more training, which is of course just rewriting history. No one was asking for more training, and so they're saying they are putting forward the carceral humanist lens of, we're going to train cops the right way. They're going to really be protectors. So yeah, we're seeing similar or same outcomes, but with different talking points. Yeah, I'll end there. Thanks.
I was gonna say that is enough bad news, but
Sorry.
no, it's all good. No, the first round is this is what it's about, and then we're gonna bring some hope the second round. So we're now gonna turn the floor over to Jordan. What shit's happening around you? Go for
That's the shit being the operative word within that question. Let's see. Yeah, so just to give a little context on me, I work with a crew called Fight Toxic Prisons, FTP. We've been organizing around the intersections of environmental justice and abolition since 2014. But what we've gotten really good at is fucking up new prisons from being built. Pardon my French, if this is on YouTube. And so we have worked directly with grassroots communities across the South, internationally, and across the country on helping develop strategies to fight new construction, usually against prisons. That's most of our experience. We don't have as much experience with jails or juvies, a little bit with immigrant detention centers. And usually those campaigns have engaged not the thousands that Micah is referencing, but tens to dozens. So I want to leave that as a little bit of hope, because we have defeated every prison we've ever faced so far. And so, we'll get more of that into the strategy, but in terms of the context around which we're organizing, I get calls maybe once a month from grassroots folks somewhere fighting new cages being built. And I think within the US context, we are really starting to see nationally, we're reaching 40, 50 years post 80s prison boom. And as a result of that, a lot of the cages that were built then are reaching their sort of natural structural end of life, right? And so across the country, we're seeing, state level and county level advancements of different prisons and jail projects, partially out of this argument that, oh, well, one, the infrastructure is failing, so we need to have better conditions for people inside. So a new shiny cage will obviously achieve that, right? And, we can dissect the bullshit within that always to Sunday for the next 2 hours. But then two, there's also, this the mixture of carceral humanism along with just a recommitment in every state to financing new construction, right? And we keep seeing like the $2 billion jail in Austin as an example. The context that I think Micah set, that's happening in Atlanta, it seems to me to be just repeating itself across the country. And so in Texas, for example, where I'm at right now, there was, an assault on bail that happened recently that's led to an explosion in county jail numbers that's being used to advance jail construction across the state. Houston County Jail, for example, 10,000 people currently incarcerated in it, and it's completely, maxed out in terms of capacity. So they've started to contract with, and this is something I think we should keep our eye on as a movement, the private prison industry's Core Civic Geo Group. They're beginning to change their strategy and get a lot more nefarious on how they're incorporating, new contracts and lobbying for jail and prison expansion. But in the Houston situation, Tutwiler is one of the private prisons I think Core Civic runs in Mississippi. They've got contracts now outsourcing prisoners from the county jail 500 miles away to Mississippi, right? And we're seeing an expansion of that pattern. On the other side of it, and I think Texas is, a unique example of this that we do need to keep an eye on. Operation Lone Star and the intersection of like crimmigration and the immigrant detention center fights, right? Operation Lone Star, for those that don't know, is an operation led by Texas Governor Greg Abbott to advance a national state of emergency, quote unquote, along the border, in which he's using what typically would be used for relief funds and other types of funds to go to actual emergencies to securitize the border. And we've seen under that at least 2 state prisons be shut down and immediately turned into immigrant detention centers, right? And so we're seeing the repackaging of carceral facilities into other types of carceral facilities instead of actually closing them. And so I think just, nationally, we're just seeing this massive wave of 80s post-prison boom transitioning into the argument for new construction, which is inevitably bigger beds to solve problems that it's not going to solve, which for me, there's a tidbit of hope in there in that, every single place I've seen these projects crop up, somebody's wanting to goddamn fight it on the ground. And so we'll get a little bit more into the strategy around how we might win that fights in a bit. But I'll say, I'll end my comments there. I know Judah's going to go deep around Central Appalachia, and we've done a lot of work there as well. But I'll kick it off to whoever's next.
All right, thanks so much for that, Jordan, and for reminding us that, where these cages are popping up, people are stepping in and fighting them, right? And pushing back. And we'll talk about where things are working well and what else needs to be worked on going forward. But before we do that, we still have the majority of the panelists to go through for this, the sad round, if we can call it that. Jack, you're up.
Hey, thanks, Justin. Thanks, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm a little sick, so I've got kind of a cough. So I'm going to try to get through some of this and then pass it on to Judah. So I'm Jack. I'm an assistant professor at Governor State near Chicago, and I haven't lived in Chicago very long, so I can't say that I'm really super active in Chicago, but I want to talk about county jail expansion, and specifically county jail expansion in Appalachia and in Kentucky and Tennessee for a sec. So like you said, I co-edited this book with Judah Shep and Lydia Palo-Hobbs called The Jail is Everywhere, and brought together a lot of essays from people who have been fighting local jail expansion across the country. And it comes out of work we've all done where we've seen that the county jail in the United States has really been an area of carceral expansion across the country. And I mean county jail, in the US there's states, and then there's the subgroup of counties. Almost every county has a jail in the United States. There are over 3,000 counties. Is generally the place where people are held for misdemeanor sentences or pretrial. And what we found is there's been sort of we call it a quiet jail boom across the country in the last 20 years. And quiet because, in some cases it's not very quiet at all, right? And in some of these big cities, in some places where there's like a lot of pushback, it's not quiet. We know about jail expansion. We know about new jails in New York City. We know about fights against new jails in LA. But where the jail growth has been really happening, or where the incarceration numbers have been increasing the most in the last 20 years, has been in rural counties and smaller cities in the US, like deindustrializing smaller cities. And I think that's important because it is quiet. So we're talking about maybe like, I don't know what the number is, over 1,000 new jails in the last 20 years or something like that. And we're talking about relatively smaller jails, small counties, rural counties, where the county will build a new jail, maybe triple or quadruple the capacity of that jail. So unless you have this sort of bigger picture, and I'm speaking from somebody who grew up in a rural area where they did this in New York State and like a little earlier in 2003. and I know, like this happens and you think like, well, I'm just from this town. I hate this town or whatever. And like, I got to get out of here. And I guess that's just my town. And it's like, it's not just your town in the US. It's like rural counties across the country have been doing it. And these expansions add up. And the result is there's a massive carceral expansion that's ongoing. A lot of it focused in smaller cities in the rural United States. So that's one thing. And to an extent, it's like a flexible capacity in a couple of ways. And it depends on where you are, but like the federal government, so federal agencies like ICE and the US Marshals primarily use local county jails as their detention capacity. So we're talking about a massive expansion of federal capacity that is flexible, right? That's locally run. So the feds can kind of like, oh, we're going to use this county. If we have a problem, we'll just go to the county over, that sort of thing. And then in states like Kentucky, Tennessee, Louisiana, I'm sure there are more, Indiana, I think still. State DOC, state departments of correction, use local jails as sort of state prisons for certain types of felonies. Often, like in Kentucky, it's Class C, Class D felonies, which is like a lot of drug-related felonies. So all that to say, it's like let me talk about Kentucky for a second. So in Kentucky, where about half of people who are held on state charges are held in local jails, this local jail expansion represents a local jail expansion, right? Which is like a local jail expansion that's done by issuing bonds, right? So it's like tying local counties, tying local governments into incarceration in an economic way for the future. And it's also a sort of, I don't know, how would we call it? Like a low key, it's like a prison expansion that's happening kind of under the radar. And I'll stop there because like then I'm going to get into the challenges of, I think, organizing around that. But I will move on. I just want to bring everybody's attention to this quiet jail boom that's happening in the US and the expansion of carceral capacity at the county level, which is to say nothing of the state and the federal level. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. Jack, we'll turn the floor over to Judah.
Thanks, Justin. Really good to be with everybody. Thanks to Justin for organizing. Thanks to the ASA for making this work logistically, for hosting us. Always good to be with comrades and friends on this panel. It's kind of great to go after Jordan and Jack because they both have talked about some of the things that I was going to say. So I'll fill in a few things here and there. I love that we're all just kind of like in conversation together, like in very concrete ways about a lot of the same struggles. So maybe I'll say one or two quick words about jail expansion, and in particular, what kind of motivated Jack and Lydia and I to edit this book that's been mentioned a few times, and some of what's come out of that about carceral expansion in all these different contexts. And then I'll finish up by talking about our big campaign in Eastern Kentucky that Jordan alluded to against FCI Letcher, a big new federal prison, and some of also what's happening surrounding it. So Jack already alluded to this, but I think what brought Jack and Lydia and I together to begin the project of building out what became this book, The Jail is Everywhere, is this sense that we got primarily from our own organizing and other political and intellectual work that jail expansion was in fact happening in all of these communities that Jack has laid out in all of his work and just did today. And in fact, the book, for people who haven't seen it, it's 11 chapters, each of which is written by an author and organizer in a different community. So there's chapters from larger cities like Atlanta and mid-sized cities like New Orleans, Sacramento, rural Oregon, upstate rural New York, to really get at both like the expansive and specific geographies in which jail expansion in particular is occurring. It's pretty remarkable like how consistent the stories are. Jordan alluded to this before, as did Micah, that all of these, I think every single chapter, maybe I'm mistaken, Jack, you should correct me if I'm wrong, but I think every single chapter speaks to the role of what I think we could and have already referred to as carceral humanism generally, although, you know, it takes shape differently in different contexts. All of these chapters refer to the sort of work of carceral humanism over the last 10 years or so, as a kind of credibilizing logic for jail expansion. In some places, that's like conditions of confinement lawsuits and concerns about overcrowding, or extending treatment or counseling or education. And in some places, it takes on or occurs in a more like explicitly almost like social justice or racial justice idiom, which is like particularly kind of grotesque, to justify carceral expansion. So that's one kind of consistent element of expansion that we noticed across these chapters. And the other, which Jack brought up, is just the role of the jail as a kind of local slash not so local development project, particularly around revenue and infrastructure. I also want to be sure to just say a little bit about what's happening in Eastern Kentucky. So Jordan and myself and literally dozens of other people are part of a coalition at the moment called Building Community, Not Prisons, to fight the newest iteration of a federal prison project for Eastern Kentucky, for a county in the southeastern part of the state called Letcher County. The prison, if it were to be built, this is a little in the weeds, but it'd be two different facilities, a medium security facility next to a work release, or not a work release, like a work, what do they call it? Like a federal work camp, something like that. All told, about 1,400 people who would be incarcerated in two different facilities, both situated on top of a mountaintop removal site. It would join and extend a particularly already like expansive carceral geography in that region, 16 prisons in total in Central Appalachia, half of which are already in Eastern Kentucky, almost all of which have been built in the last 3 decades or so. If that sounds familiar to folks, it's because we already defeated this prison a few years ago in 2019, or an earlier iteration of it. It was like a 4-year fight. Against what at that time was called United States Penitentiary Letcher, USP Letcher. I'll talk in the second half, or maybe Jordan will, about some of the contours of these two fights and what's changed and why it's important to kind of pay attention to both. But it's important to say that this fight continues. It happened already. It's happening again, which speaks both, I think, to the like recalcitrance of the carceral state, as well as our persistence. The one other thing I wanted to be sure to say, just in this kind of initial depressing but also larger framing moment, is this, and it sort of ties in what Jack was talking about with respect to Kentucky, that even as we're part of, Jordan and myself and all these other people are part of this like robust coalition to defeat FCI Letcher, as we should be, because it's this moment of acute, concentrated carceral expansion, even as that's happening at the federal scale in Eastern Kentucky, all the jails, also in Eastern Kentucky, are at somewhere between 140 and 220% capacity. Just, what day was that? Thursday, as lots of our comrades were in Letcher County at this big meeting that the Bureau of Prison hosted about the prison. On that same day, there was a front page story in the county newspaper about Letcher County potentially transforming a rec center into a new jail. So there's, just as we're fighting this big federal prison in the same exact county, there's at least talk about building out a new jail. And then just a couple counties away, 2 different state prisons have either reopened or added on double the capacity. By my calculations, it's like 1,500 or so, actually a little bit more than that, additional beds that have been added at the state prison level. So we're talking federal level, state level, Department of Corrections, and of course, local jails. Point just being that I think we have to be, as everybody is talking about, we have to be attuned at all of those scales to the way carceral expansion is happening, even as we might have to fight at one scale, and concentrate all our efforts there in a given moment. I'll stop there. Yeah, great to be in conversation with folks.
All right, thanks for that, Judah. We'll now turn to McCole and Lee. What's going on in your area and where are you working on?
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, it's really a thrill to be with everybody. And So I'm Nicole Siegel, and I teach at Indiana University. And while we're talking books, I will just maybe hopefully remind folks that I wrote Violence Work, State Power and the Limits of Police, which is sometimes helpful for thinking about the relationship between policing and state power, and also has lots of lessons for how profoundly we need to be working on non-state options as abolitionists. And I think a lot of our conversation today is about scale. It seems that we're all talking about the interrelated scales of carceral expansion in our contexts. And it just strikes me that we're also interrelated as scholar activists. And I just want to just appreciate a couple of you directly. You know, we are in Bloomington, Indiana, in Monroe County, Indiana, fighting a jail expansion project, which is a repeat of a 2008 jail expansion project, which we also fought. And I fought that together with Judah Shept, who wrote his dissertation about that fight and turned it into Progressive Punishment. Still one of the absolute best books on carceral humanism in situ and jail fights, anti-jail fights. And also we rely deeply on the work that Jack Norton did. Jack, when you were at Vera, that awesome work that you did on states and on Indiana specifically. And, you know, we're in conversation with Jordan. We've had FTP people come to town and be on our local radio show, Kite Line, and we love and build on FTP. And of course, Micah, you know, we have lots of folks working on Block Cop City in Bloomington, Indiana, and we have a sense, you know, in fact, the people who started Care Not Cages, one of them is currently facing RICO and DT charges for activism in Atlanta. And we see the fights as intimately interrelated. So just to note that there are all these levels of interrelationship already undergirding our work, just as there are these multiscalar interrelations undergirding the carceral expansion that we are also all fighting. So let me get local. I mean, it's, you know, Jack and Judah have already really described a lot of what we're facing pretty precisely. We had sentencing redefinition in 2014 that changed, that was supposed to be kind of truth in sentencing plus easing up on the sentences so that people would have an opportunity to have shorter sentences, but they'd have to fulfill all of them or closer to all of them, and that there would be resources for, you know, post-release and alternatives and treatment. Of course, the post-release and alternatives and treatment didn't pan out, and the reductions in sentencing didn't really pan out. The truth in sentencing panned out so that people are spending a lot more time in some kind of cage. And also the shift from state prisons to county jails happened to absorb the new sentencing, which made some crimes into lower level felonies or misdemeanors and allowed county jails to cage those people. So now county jails took over a big chunk of folks who were in state prisons. It slightly relieved state prison overcrowding, but then the truth in sentencing element filled those beds back up. And meanwhile, the county jails are overflowing, and a very large number of Indiana counties are now facing new jail construction, including our county, Monroe County. So you wanted to say something about the ACLU?
Well, I just, so one of the, I think it's the carceral humanism aspect, is that the ACLU has brought a lawsuit against Monroe County representatives and also other counties in Indiana, declaring that the jail is overcrowded and that they're not meeting the constitutional rights of those there, which has promoted in our community, you know, this idea of a nicer prison, you know, a nicer jail. If we had a nicer jail, you know, the ACLU wants a nicer jail, we should have a nicer jail. And so, you know, there
should be blue walls and plants. People should be able to garden at this new jail. I mean, it's really an absurd echo of the kinds of carceral humanist rhetoric that we heard in the first round of our lifetimes, of our activist lifetimes in 2008.
And you know, that's so one of the things that the county government, when they say, why do we need to spend $100 million on a new facility, it's because so that, you know, we can have a nicer jail. And so it's being pushed by this idea of that a jail could be nice, which is.
And it's quite astonishing how still just intimately people can marry these two rhetorics of being against jails and wanting a nicer jail. And most intensely, I think, is the attorney of the ACLU, whose name is Ken Falk, who openly boasts of pushing county after county in Indiana to build new jails. And he's, and yet he is, as this progressive lefty ACLU person, it imagines himself as anti-incarceration. And we definitely see the three C's operating here of compassion, capacity, and I'll get that third C for you in just a second. Do you want to talk about the funding mechanism?
Well, I think that one of the things that you guys talked about, which we've seen in Indiana and now in Monroe County specifically, is this use of the funding mechanism of the lease bond, and the lease bond is the answer to all the problems that local counties have in generating the amount of cash that create. We're going from like a 279 bed facility to now they've limited it to 400, but it was going to be a lot bigger than that because they want to build the big prisons because of this, what Mr. Norton talked about this flexibility of housing both state, ICE, and federal people in that facility.
One of the sometimes the top category, the top reason that people are in our local jail is hold for other jurisdictions, which can mean hold for ICE, hold for other counties, or hold for the state, and all of which are various kinds of money-making ventures for the county. So the three C's, it's from this wonderful recent prison policy article that we're using a lot, is capacity, that we need a bigger jail; contemporary, that the jail is outdated; and compassionate, that carceral humanism. So it's pretty depressing, and I'm looking forward to this conversation to hopefully get some inspiration and ease up on some pretty rough burnout that we feel for just feeling like we're in this rut of fighting for the second time and fighting with people whose rhetoric matches ours in some ways, but that they're ignoring the implications of their positions.
Okay, thanks for that. That was a solid first round, and maybe I'll just try and do a brief recap. But we seem to be hearing a lot of common themes. One of them that struck me as someone who been part of campaigning against what was originally supposed to be a bigger replacement jail in Ottawa, that goes away and becomes a bunch of smaller projects across the landscape of Eastern Ontario with a new small correctional complex in Brockville, an expansion of an existing facility in Brockville, an expansion of the Napanee Detention Center, and then this new prison in Kemptville. So they've dispersed the 725 beds across several smaller projects in conservative friendly ridings where I presumably would be more difficult to oppose carceral expansion than say in Ottawa, which is a city of about 1 million people, that had dozens of groups participating in the Nope campaign. So these projects that are coming back from the dead and reconfiguring themselves in new ways that perhaps pose new challenges for organizing that we can think about. And certainly in the Canadian context, really since the the whole post Second World War period, we've had what Judah would call progressive punishment, or these compassionate carceral humanist justified cages being built for a long time. You can't build a prison in Canada and not talk about rehabilitation. You haven't been able to do that for a very, very long time, and it seems that increasingly in the United States that rhetoric has been there for after a lot of critique of the prison boom that you saw mostly in the 1980s and 1990s. A lot of interesting things here. The financing thing struck me as well. We're doing things through, we don't have privately operated prisons in Canada, but we do have, private public partnerships for pretty much everything else. So like to design, build, finance, and maintain these facilities over 30-year prison mortgages, the food, the phones, everything else that prison profiteers make money off of. It's this privatization by stealth that seems to be going on. And anyway, so a lot of recurring themes across all your different remarks, and like the policing in case of Cop City, and in the case of the prison infrastructure that we've talked about, they're responding to radical and progressive critiques and repackaging things in certainly interesting ways that we have to contend with now. So we'll come back. I guess we'll start back at the top. We'll go to Micah and get to the second question that's going to guide us this round before we get into Q&A with folks joining online as well. What are some of the lessons you've learned from campaigns to build communities and not cop shops and cages that you think we can take with us for future abolitionist organizing towards decarceral futures? Like what's hopeful out there? How are people winning? We've just described a lot of difficult developments that are happening, but there are some wins that are being had as well. So what should we take with us going forward? Micah.
Cool. Okay, a couple more points. The first, which will be a little overstated because it's certainly not true everywhere, but I think it kind of is that I think abolition is popular, even if the label is not. And I think, polling, whatever, people like to talk about polling for, are we following it? Are we shaping it? Whatever. I think that something that the Stop Cop City movement has taught me is that, safety is popular. And so abolitionist ideas are popular. And, an example of this is that, so people have been showing up to Atlanta City Hall for years at this point, giving hours and hours and hours of public comment, talking about why they don't want to see Cop City. And one of the really striking things in all of those sessions, and I especially think back to a session in June 2023 that shattered the record for in-person public comment. It was over 14 hours that we sat in Atlanta City Hall, listening to people go one after another, talking about, why they were opposed to Cop City. But what I think was so amazing about it is that probably most of those people would not call themselves abolitionists. But consistently, people were talking about not just why they don't want Cop City, but what they do want. And they were talking about schools, they were talking about mental and physical health, they were talking about affordable housing, the crisis of homelessness in Atlanta. They were talking about streetlights and, potholes, which are awful in Atlanta. They were talking about bike lanes and biker safety and pedestrian safety. They were talking about parks and green space. They talked about the fact that the city had closed the pools early, or were planning to close the pools early that summer. They talked about arts and culture. They talked about childcare. They talked about all of these different public services that they wanted to see funded, which I think to me was very much, articulating an abolitionist vision of safety. While again, like I think probably most of those people would not say that they're an abolitionist, which is fine. So I think that, that's one of the first lessons that that I've taken away, is that, people want to feel safe. They want to feel more than safe. They want to feel happy. And I think that, that's, I think maybe it just comes back to the very basic point at this point of, abolition as a positive project. But I think that's, my first point. And it's been really cool to see that so vividly among a lot of people, who probably wouldn't call themselves abolitionists. A couple other quick points on like takeaways is one, and, this is certainly taken from Ruth Wilson Gilmore and others, is we have to be thinking about how we're going to protect our wins as we're fighting for them. So, in Atlanta, like I said, we got the 2019 announcement that they were going to close the jail, and then conditions changed, COVID hit, Biden was elected. There was a different federal sort of background where our local mayor was not trying to look progressive in the same way. And they reversed that. And the base had sort of fallen apart during COVID that was able to get those wins. And so, we need to be thinking about how to protect our wins. The next quick one is that's something I found really hopeful, is that struggle, and this is again nothing new, is that struggle is really radicalizing. Another really hopeful thing to me about this movement has been, sort of in the beginning, there were people about the Stop Cop City movement, I should say. In the beginning, people, were really coming to it for all different reasons: environmental, policing. People worried about, just basic democracy and transparency. Cop City is located outside of city limits, even though it's owned by the city, and so it hasn't had to go through like the normal procedures that a project of that scale would normally go through. And so people were coming for all these different reasons. And especially sort of that first summer of the movement in 2021, there were environmentalists who just wanted to protect the forest, who were saying things like, oh, just don't build this thing here, build Cop City somewhere else. And now a lot of those same people have seen that when you try to do the very modest thing of protecting forest land in the midst of climate disaster, the police are the ones who show up to arrest your ass. And so I think that, it's been really radicalizing for a lot of people who went from saying, no Cop City here in the forest to now saying no Cop City anywhere. So I think struggle is radicalizing, and that's really hopeful to me, because I think it, speaks to the fact that we don't all need to be on the same page going into things, and we can sometimes get on the same page by struggling together. And then the last thing that I think, a huge lesson that I've taken away from this movement that is still ongoing, is that we need a true diversity of tactics, including militant direct action. So, I mean, just to give an example, the summer 2021 was sort of like the first big push against Cop City, where people, were doing a lot of like the normal things that you do in a campaign. They were canvassing, they were doing petitions, they were doing rallies and protests, showing up to City Hall, sort of all of the things that you think of. And that led to this amazing result of 17 hours of virtual public comment, where, the vast majority of people were saying, don't build Cop City. And of course, without basically any discussion, the city council passed it anyway. And I think that's a time when sometimes like campaigns fall apart, because, you lost the legislative victory. It feels really hopeless. Feels like we did everything we could. And in some ways, the movement did sort of fall apart at that point. But then it was given this new life as forest defenders actually took to the forest, the Weelaunee forest that's, under threat. And they put their bodies on the line and started living in the forest and saying like, okay, the city council can approve it. The Atlanta Police Foundation can fund it. You can say you're going to build this thing, but you still actually need to do it. And we're going to, people are saying they're going to go and stop you from doing it. And they've, for a long time, over a year, repelled contractors and, really took on militant action, to delay the project, which was, they say Cop City was supposed to open last spring. And, here we are, and it's nowhere close. And so they've won enormous delays, which is really amazing. And so I think we cannot understate the importance of militant direct action. And we're seeing that across struggles. The Mountain Valley Pipeline, we're seeing it with people putting on their bodies on the line for Palestine. Like there's so many places where we see this militant direct action. And I think especially for people who are in more sort of like formal and nonprofit-y spaces, one of the really cool things about the struggle in Atlanta has been that like that echelon of the struggle has been really supportive. At the least, people have not denounced the militants. And often they've said like, yeah, we tried everything. We did your petitions, we did your ballot initiative, we came to City Hall, we did all the formal channels of engagement. You still ignored us. And so, yeah, we support people who are taking militant action. And then at the same time, just a couple quick other points within this diversity of tactics, canvassing, something that I think people in the movement have reflected on is that it's, we brought a massive number of people in. There are many, many everyday people in, and still sometimes it feels like sort of like a mass or sort of like a popular activist movement. and there's always more we can do in terms of canvassing. And you know, I think that canvassing gets overlooked because it's not sexy and it's not, you know, flashy, but really like building the base has to be one of the biggest parts. The last thing I'll say is that, you know, this comes back to sort of the militant action is something that I've learned from seeing, you know, people who I don't know, these are often anonymous people taking action, is that, you know, these are systems that we're fighting against, but there are also individuals behind systems. And those individuals are lawmakers and all the normal people you think of, but they're also the contractors and, you know, the people who work for these companies, the CEOs, the executives, you know, the funders, and people have taken continued action to show up at people's houses, protest, and say, like, if you want to destroy a forest and build a massive police warfare facility, you're gonna, you know, your life won't be as easy or as pleasant. And so, yeah, I think just emphasizing that, you know, narrative, canvassing, direct action, you know, systems, individual. I think we need everything everywhere. And that's really hard, but I think also really important. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Micah. Everything everywhere. Jordan, you're up.
Yeah, my caffeine's finally starting to kick in, so we'll see if this is coherent. But yeah, I want to start by doing a little context setting. You know, I am not only hopeful in terms of our movement's ability to win these fights, I'm dead set certain on our ability to win these fights. The reason I'm certain on that is because, you know, over the last decade, my crew and I have, of all the campaigns that we've been involved in which we've had a direct hand in crafting and executing the strategy with grassroots communities on the ground, not only within the abolitionist movement, but within labor and other movement spaces, we have yet to lose. We remain undefeated. And we remain undefeated in the most unlikely of circumstances, right? The people we've been able to get involved in the campaign have ranged from different campaign settings, have ranged from 5 to 8 people up to dozens of people, right? That's not a lot of capacity. When it comes to new construction fights, the amount of money that we've been given to fight these campaigns in the past has ranged from $10,000 a year to, you know, in Alabama, where we were asked by community members who are not abolitionists, mind you, as abolitionists, to come in and help them build a coalition to defeat the Alabama governor's plan to build 3 mega prisons at the time. That entire campaign, which is still ongoing, has run 3 years. The entire campaign, we've spent $8,000. And, you know, we keep being told by friend and foe alike, when we start all of these campaigns, that it's impossible, we shouldn't fight, there's no way you can win that. And in every single situation, we have come out victorious, right? And so I think for me, that points to lessons that we can learn across movement contexts about the real depth and power of a small group of people if you develop your strategy and a fully fledged diversity of tactics like Micah's alluding to. And so I'll give, you know, a few examples, but I think, you know, as we're thinking about these fights, and I actually remembered in regards to the previous question, in terms of like the state of fighting new construction across the country, a couple of years ago, we got a question. We were like, how many new construction projects are happening in the US? We couldn't find the number anywhere. And so we went and did a little bit of research, and it turns out, oh, there was over 100 new jail and prison construction projects alone across the country. And in almost every single one of those circumstances, we did find people on the ground, you know, willing to oppose. And I think, you know, that is the first, I think, lesson to tease out is there's a bit of a speed and rapidity that needs to happen in those situations. There's always going to be people in the communities, and a lot of our work is with rural white conservative communities who do want to fight these things, right? And I think that's a lesson that we need to draw from the South in terms of our overall movement work, is that, you know, we know who our enemies here in the South, right? It's very clear who's against us and who's for us. There's no, you know, face like with liberals and with conservatives, like you just know where you stand, right? And we move accordingly based on that So our coalition in Alabama, it's a bipartisan coalition. Like I said, we're the only abolitionists involved for a long time. And I think one of the lessons to pull out is really leaning into and developing your unlikely allies. And as you know, we're looking at this massive wave of new prison construction. I think another thing that we need to begin thinking about as a movement is what are those higher levels of infrastructure that we can begin building to assist those campaigns at a grassroots level, right? So to give one example, in terms of the Alabama fight and work that's developed out of that, to try and develop some of these tools at a broader movement level. The first, Alabama, we're still fighting this fight, right? It's the exact same story we've heard again and again here. We defeated the original plan to build 3 mega prisons. Absolutely fucking kicked their asses. Like it was glorious. And the way that we did it, and I want to harken back to what McCall is saying around the financing, is we ended up engaging a network of activist investors that had been involved in the immigrant detention center struggle, right? And we're specifically targeting Core Civic. And Core Civic was originally going to be they were going to be prison landlords in this Alabama fight. They were going to own but not operate 2 of the prisons to the tune of like $30 million a year in a contract in which they could negotiate every year the terms of the contract, right? Absolutely ridiculous. So they got involved via that angle, and together, let me see here. Together, we ended up going after, it was the same bond financing situation, right? A lot of the states and a lot of the communities, these prisons and jails, the actual infrastructural cost is massive. State, especially in county municipalities, they don't have this money lying around, right? They need to get it from somewhere, and they quite often get it from the bond market. And so what we did was we got with those activist investors and with our coalition on the ground, which included, you know, people living immediately next to the proposed prison site. And we went after the goddamn banks underwriting the prison bonds, right? And, you know, we can get into the details around all of that strategy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about strategy before passing it on. But after a very sort of coordinated push, we ended up, where's my slide? There we go. Let me share this real quick. We ended up getting the lead underwriter to drop the project, Barclays and their army of goddamn lawyers in London in a tower. We got them to drop the bond after the bond was on the market. This is unheard of. It's unprecedented. And it was a bunch of folks in Alabama, goddamn, sitting in our couches during COVID, working with the most unlikely of allies and capitalizing on those opportunities that forced Barclays to drop the bond as lead underwriter, and then forced the other 2 banks that were the underwriters under Barclays to also back out, right? And, you know, this is a fight in which we had 10 people actively involved at the core of it. And, you know, I think to me, that points towards a few lessons on strategy, right? I think a lot of times our movements are miseducated. I'm feeling like Lauryn Hill over here, y'all. Miseducated when it comes to strategic development and how to actually create grassroots campaign strategy that is iterative and adaptive to the local context, the targets, et cetera. I think, you know, a lot of times when I talk with grassroots groups about strategy development, there's 2 problems. One, there's really not an understanding or a delineation between strategies and tactics on the one hand, right? We conflate these, and tactics are the strategy that's being talked about, and there's not really any thought to an actual overarching strategic framework. And then 2, when there is a thought to an overarching strategic framework, and this is, you know, this might be context specific within the US, other folks can tell me, but there's a really just bad approach, I would say, to understanding what strategy is. And it boils down to this idea that I keep hearing called escalation strategy. In that, oh, we just need to keep escalating in order to win. We just need to get more people. We need to knock on more doors. We need to raise more money. We need to get, you know, more people involved. When I know that is not true, and it is quite often ineffective, because if I am your enemy and I am thinking, oh, what do I need to do to defeat your strategy? If your strategy is escalation strategy, all I need to do is outweigh your ability to escalate. and then you're going to lose, right? And so for me, and what I advocate with folks on the ground is we need to take a really robust and iterative approach to our strategy development that really centers a few key things, right? One, who is the team we're getting together to execute this strategy, right? You know, I said my controversial opinion, you can win any campaign with 5 to 8 people. More experienced opinion doesn't mean you should, because it's really tiring and there's a lot of burnout involved. And so my new advice I give to grassroots campaigns is, if you want to pursue any particular strategic or tactical angle, get at least 5 to 8 people to run that tactic or run that strategy, right? But then two, I think it's also a matter of intelligence gathering. And I think this is where our movements have not really taken lessons from our enemies in terms of COINTELPRO, in terms of the CIA, et cetera. You know, intelligence wins campaigns, and our ability to gather intelligence wins campaigns. When we're running campaigns, we want to know not only what our enemy is thinking before they think it, we want to know what they're saying in the rooms that they're planning these things in. And so for me, I know a lot of the folks in the audience are academics. Ethnography, qualitative research methods. How do you go about collecting data from people that do not want to give you data when you're studying up? All of these things, I think, are fundamental in terms of intelligence gathering when developing and crafting a campaign strategy. And then I'll just mention a couple other things and I'll pass it on. You know, I think for me also, you know, we need to fight, honestly, people we would think are allies, right? Sometimes it's the ACLU. Sometimes it is these larger nonprofits that come in with this sheen of, oh, hey, we're here to do good. We're all in social justice, progressive shit spaces together. When in reality, you know, in the best case scenarios, quite often they're going to sell you out once there's a strategy or tactic that comes on board where they're like, they can see an easy win, and an easy win that can be communicated to funders and communicated to a base to raise money around. And so I think in regards to that, when you're starting these campaigns and building coalition or campaign structures, it's really goddamn important to get a set of fundamental strategic agreements, that we call them, within building communities, not prisons. That for us, you know, our priority is they explicitly state, hey, we are going to stop all new prison construction together. We are not going to capitulate to reformist demands of the state. And we are agreeing to this in terms of building long-term movement work together, in order to guard against the co-optation of our movement energy and guard against the eventual splintering of campaigns or coalitions. You know, and I think an example of that splintering can be seen with what's happened around Rikers, right? And the borough-based jails coming in from the city, splintering the Close Rikers coalition. And I'll shut up now. I'll just say, we think about strategy a goddamn lot. And so we're trying to distill all the lessons we've learned from different organizations and campaigns into a training series for, and it's available to all y'all, a training series for grassroots campaigns wanting to develop strategy in terms of like everything we've talked about. How do you win in the most unwinnable of circumstances? So please feel free, you know, hit me up if any folks want it. Jordan at canopymovement.com. And yeah, that's like a 2-day, 3-day training. And I will shut up now because I could keep talking forever about these things.
Well, thanks for that, Jordan. Really appreciated that. We'll now turn to Jack.
Hey, thanks everyone. Hang on. I'll just be quick. Okay, so in terms of I'll say like what I've learned from like watching this jail expansion happen over the last, I don't know how many years it's been. The first, I guess it's like, just quickly, there's a bunch of things, and one thing that I've been thinking about is like just this need to operate on like different registers. And I feel like it's pretty obvious to folks who have been involved in some of these anti-jail campaigns, but it's like on one hand, the minutia of how like the criminal legal system works in a county is going to be really important for an anti-jail fight. And I say that reluctantly because it's like I don't want people to get dragged into it, basically. So we see that it's like try to oppose a jail, and then activists get that thrown on them. Like, okay, well then how are you going to keep people out of the jail? And then they have to do all of this sort of analysis of what people are getting locked up and what are they going to do and who's in jail for what. And all of a sudden they're like trying to, they have like a shadow committee that's like trying to run the jail or something. And that's not what they're trying to do. But it's super important because it really matters. And when you're organizing in real places, you have to be able to speak that language. And so what am I saying? It's like, yeah, that's one register, get help doing that. That's one thing that's important. But on the other hand, it's like this jail expansion that has been going on all over the country. It is like, so let's say like the book that we edited, it's called Fighting the New Geography of Mass Incarceration. And then that new geography is just basically like jail incarceration rates falling in bigger cities. I mean, this can all change, right? And it's like rising in rural areas, rising in smaller deindustrialized cities. And it's like there's this new geography of jail incarceration and jail expansion, but it's like it's the geography of like a certain of class warfare in the United States. So it's like this stuff is class warfare, right? Like the jail, and there are many ways we can think about it that way, but like that is really important. That's the other register. So it's like the jail expansion in Indiana, the lease purchasing thing, I'm not sure that makes sense to me, but it's like, from what I know about Indiana, for example, it's like these jails are being built with bonds floated. The thing backing the bonds is like sales tax. So it's like regressive taxation. I don't know. But again, I'm in the minutia of the financing. But it's like the jail expansion, it's like when this county is building a new jail, it's often because the jail is like really quote unquote overcrowded. I hate that word overcrowded, but it's because of criminalization. And so like in Kentucky right now, Senate Bill 5 has passed. I was texting with Judah on the side here. I think it's passed both houses. It might get vetoed. It's going to get overridden. Anyway, this bill that's going to criminalize more stuff in Kentucky, a place where a lot is criminalized. And it's going to push people in jail, and it's going to put pressure on the jails. And counties across Kentucky are going to have to do something about it, right? And so it's like there are plans going to criminalize more people in Kentucky. And every time there's like this kind of a plan and there's a jail expansion plan, it's what I'm saying is like this is a development plan. This is like literally a development plan. It's a vision for the future that they're going to make reality. And it is this sort of class warfare. It's a way of disciplining labor. It's a way of making people surplus and vulnerable to premature death. And it's a way of doing that. You know, it's a plan for the next 20 or 30 years. And it's war. And I think, and yeah, so the basic thing that I'm saying is it's like, I think it's necessary to remember that, and to be thinking about that, even if you find yourself in a position of like trying to talk about, you know, what percentage of people are there pre-trial. And so it's like, you need to defend bail reform, need to defend these wins, and need to keep in mind that like, there is this sort of like bipartisan plan unfolding to lock people up and to kill people in a way. So that's all. I'm at 5 minutes. I'm gonna pass to Judah.
Hey, Judah.
Thanks, y'all. There's one of the chapters in the book that Jack and I co-edited with Lydia is written by James Kilgore, friend of all of ours, about this ongoing iterative fight in Urbana-Champaign, where he lives and organizes and teaches and writes against lots of iterations of a jail. And he says something in there like, I think he's quoting Ruthie Gilmore, actually saying you have to become a nerd. Organizers have to become nerds. And he said one of the ways that they fought at least one, if not a couple of the iterations of a jail proposal there is they became the experts. Like his group became the experts on the county budget and jail and what could be afforded, what could be done differently. And to me, that speaks to sort of I thought about saying maybe like two things here in this section. And to me, this is the thing that has resonated with me the most, particularly with respect to our fight in Eastern Kentucky, but obviously also this is at work in the jail book, which is just the importance of principled study of the conditions that you're fighting. So James is talking about it with respect to fighting the jail in Urbana-Champaign. I wanted to say something a little bit about what that I think has meant for us fighting the prison in Eastern Kentucky, both iterations of it. Because I think understanding both like the balance of power and the configurations of power and how they change, sometimes in response to our work, is really important, both for like what might be changing opportunities for political intervention and leverage, and of course also narrative changes. So just to be very concrete about this, the first time the Letcher prison was proposed, first of all, it's discussion about it started in 2005. Like, so we're almost 20 years into this being on the table, but momentum picked up like in 2014, 2015, and the fight really got particularly sort of acute from, I'd say, 2015-ish to 2019 when it was defeated. At least for the first couple years during that particularly acute moment of fighting, I would say that there was a pretty coherent block, like power block behind it, right? So the Obama administration was totally in support. So the Obama Department of Justice and Bureau of Prisons. Congress had appropriated $500 million. So there was legislative support. And then there was a lot of support locally, particularly in the form of this like quasi-public, really sort of private block of petty bourgeois power brokers locally. But there was like, support at all these different scales. We defeated that. And I think even as that prison is now back on the table, right? That's what we're fighting right now in the form of Federal Correctional Institute Letcher. Again, just to reiterate, same proposal more or less for a prison on the same mountaintop in Eastern Kentucky. Even as it's back on the table 3.5 years later, I think the configuration of power has actually shifted a lot, and there's a lot of internal contradictions and tensions that are there for us to exploit and highlight. So, for example, the Bureau of Prisons itself has admitted that the prison is unneeded by their own calculations and logics because of the declining federal prison population. They've had to admit that it's not really necessary in terms of like correctional policy or whatever. They've had to admit, because of our challenges, in the form of a coalition, that their projections for economic development were totally overblown. And every administration, starting in 2017, I think both the Trump and Biden administrations have proposed in their federal budgets rescinding the funds, taking back the funds for the prison. All of that is just to say that paying attention to all of that, I think, is really important. It might make sense, like rhetorically, to talk about the carceral state. I mean, of course it does. And at the same time, to recognize that that's made up of all these different capacities, which can shift in response to what we do. And then that opens up opportunities for us to kind of make certain interventions and point out those contradictions and tensions. This was fully on display a couple nights ago in this meeting that I mentioned, where because people had studied this environmental impact statement that the Bureau of Prisons had released, where they had to admit certain things, our people who got up and spoke could point out areas within the environmental impact statement and say, listen to what the BOP is admitting. There's not going to be the jobs here that they had said at some point that there would be. The prison isn't necessary. It's not recession proof, all these kinds of things. So that's point one, is just the importance of studying the conditions. The second thing I'll say, and last thing before I pass it off, is just the importance of, at least I'd say for both prisons and jails, the importance of them to questions of really uneven development. To listen the other night to supporters of the prison, of which there were many, get up and speak. Everybody. I mean, Jordan, if you heard something different, you should correct me. But I think every single person who spoke in favor of the prison, which is the same thing that happened last time, spoke about the importance of jobs and infrastructure and rural healthcare and roads and even like school enrollments, keeping people in the county instead of, an exodus of folks moving away because of the lack of all of those things. So the point just being, like, if the prison is actually as much, if not more, about questions of development, then I think us as organizers and abolitionists and whatnot have to also speak at that register, and also think about our interventions meeting those kinds of needs. Right. So even as we, of course, have to think about alternatives to incarceration and alternatives to calling the cops and transformative justice projects and all that kind of stuff, which we do and which is so crucial, I think we also have to think about our work. At that in that idiom and in terms of sort of those material conditions for which the prisons are proposed as putative, horrific solutions. I'll stop there. Thank you all.
Okay, thanks for that, Judah, and for reminding us, in our work, we have to articulate the decarceral future that we want to build and get people on board with that as we try and say build communities, not cages, right? That we're trying again to point to this abolition as a positive vision. It's not just about stopping things and shutting things down. It's about building something better. And getting people on board with believing that and working towards it. So we'll go to Nicole and Lee. Do you have anything to add on this question?
Yes. Unfortunately, some of it is a little bit in a more depressive vein. I think, I'm excited to talk more about some other kinds of strategies. Jordan, we got to get you to come on down here and give us one of these campaign trainings for sure. One of the big lessons from our, we've been working on this particular campaign for 2 years, is that that public officials are totally fine ignoring us. We can get up, as you're saying, Judah, and make all these arguments, and they can be the smartest and most true and right arguments in the universe. And they're just like, oh, did we hear a noise in the chamber? We can get up there and do all kinds of dramatic shit, like we put George Washington powdered wigs on our heads and went with our academic regalia and did guerrilla theater, and we can talk to them directly. We can write articles in the local paper, and they're just like, oh, there's some breeze in the background here. Oh yes, so jail transition team. Let's allocate $600,000 to 6 new people to run the jail transition team. Oh, we haven't finished the feasibility study yet. Oh well. Oh, we also need 3 positions to run mental health and transition reentry services in the jail. No, we don't have the money for that, but we do have the money for 6 new transition. That's just to give you an example of what happened last week. Another related lesson is just how incredibly difficult it is to get what feels to us in the campaign like a critical mass of people participating in the campaign. How difficult it is to get that critical mass, because some part of carcerality is still the dominant paradigm, even in its kinder, gentler iterations. And so even among people who are calling themselves opponents of mass incarceration, they are still operating under a framework that is overwhelmingly carceral. And people in our county right now seem to just be saying, well, gosh, we've been talking about building a new jail for so long, it must be needed. Let's just get it over with, and then we'll move on to solving the other problems later. Obviously, we've just been dilly-dallying for too long, and there's just this kind of fatigue generated that is meshing perfectly with carcerality as a rhetoric that is supporting prison building. So those are the kind of depressing lessons. Here's a couple less depressing ones. The first one is that burnout can be reframed as building. So, you've been working for 2 years, and sometimes we talk about a feeling of burnout, but then sometimes some of us try to suggest that what we've actually been doing is a really careful building, and we've been learning as, Judah, you suggest, to the conditions that we're fighting. And, we've got, like, for example, Lee could tell you the ins and outs of every funding mechanism and all of the taxation plans and lease bond plans in the county. I mean, there's nobody understands this stuff better than Lee Gruntafer, I believe. And so we're getting that, and we have that now, and we could use it to move forward. And maybe what we need is an infusion of the kind of rudder work that you're talking about, Jordan, where the tiny rudder steers the big ship. The other lesson is that divisions within the government, divisions of scale, city versus county versus state, and divisions of territory, like different cities and municipal districts, can be turned against each other. So early on, we really successfully turned the city against the county and got the city zoning board to refuse to rezone the first site that the county was proposing for the jail. And that was a great victory. And since then, they've been unable to get a better site, and they're on site number 3 right now, 2 iterations of it, and we're going to fight that one with different arguments. We're just always, and we've turned the sheriff against the county commissioners really, really publicly and beautifully, and the sheriff has been helpful in that. So like, don't discount any possible ally, yes. The next lesson, 3 out of 4 that I've got here, is that the horizon is long. So this is a kind of a hope is a choice sort of framing, that the sort of apocalyptic framing of, if they build the jail, we've lost and the end is nigh. We have to refuse that what we're looking at is fighting this fight to win, yes, but also to build. And that what we're building is not only a campaign against the jail, but also all of the autonomous structures alongside it, the interrelation of the like for us by us movements in the county that are for folks wrestling with addiction or housing or poverty, building all the structures that people actually need to live beautifully alongside each other. And that, so the building of those projects in autonomous non-state ways is crucial for that long horizon. And then the last one is that art is good. The last lesson, and we just came through this really wonderful film series that was totally the inspiration of just one of our members, carried out by diverting resources from the university, which is in the town. So, Black study, yes. And so we had this wonderful film series, and it really got us just moving in a different way. It fought burnout and it brought new people to the campaign. What do you want to add? I'm good. Okay, we're good for now.
Okay, thank you very much for that. A lot of great lessons on the table that we can take forward with us in this very long struggle, especially with these new configurations and rebirths of projects we've fought in the past, and as we try and bring into being something else. So I'll just check here. Not sure, because we don't see the YouTube in front of us in terms of the comments, so I'm not sure if there's been audience questions yet, but we are going to look into that shortly. But as each other was speaking, I was wondering if any of you wanted to jump in and intervene or say anything else before we turn to the audience. And the chat's actually been quite active, a lot of encouragement for different things that are being said here that we can, for our internal chat for the panelists here. So I know, Jordan, you wanted to add a few things. I'm just going to turn it to you right now.
Oh yeah, sometimes my stream of consciousness is more a river and I miss some finer points I wanted to bring up. Judah had to deal a lot of this when I was in class with him. But yeah, a couple of things I wanted to hit on that I forgot to mention. Like one, in terms of my commentary around, building larger pieces of movement infrastructure, I think that a lot of times when it comes to fighting new construction, which I think one is a lot easier than fighting current prisons, jails, et cetera, that are existing. I just want to state that. But I think in terms of fighting new construction, one of the best approaches to strategy that we've used across the campaigns in the South has been a war of attrition. Developing as many roadblocks, blunders, monkey wrenching, that we can, throwing every obstacle possible in our enemy's path who are trying to build the thing along every single stage along the process, right? They've got to get architects to design it. They've got to get the financing. They've got to find land. Where is that land coming from? Is it state owned? Is it owned by local folks, right? And really just nitty gritty getting in there with enough lead time as possible to identify every single goddamn intervention point and then intervene in them, right? So I think, when it comes to new construction, that war of attrition is quite helpful. And if we're thinking about all of those points of intervention, they are quite common across campaigns because all those steps need to happen to build a new thing, right? Which means if the intervention point is common, we can begin developing higher levels of movement infrastructure to support those intervention points. And so I forgot to name the work of some of our partners when talking about the financing piece. So what ended up happening after we defeated Barclays and killed the first iteration of that prison plan was we came together and we're like, yo, there's no silver bullets when it comes to winning campaigns, but that's the closest goddamn thing I've ever seen in terms of fighting new construction projects with that specific type of bond structure. And so what we did was we went and created the investor circle toward decarceration, which is made up of grassroots community activists alongside activist investors that we've worked with who are working on developing a toolkit right now to educate our communities. One, what the hell is a bond? I still don't know, y'all. I'll let the investors explain it to me. But, working on developing resources to help our communities understand these different intervention points and really engage in it, right? And so I think, across, the different intervention and tactical engagements we can build against new construction, there's a lot of opportunities like this that we need to begin thinking about and investing broader movement resources into. And I'll stop there.
Hey, thanks for that, Jordan. Are there other thoughts that folks wanted to put on the table? Okay, we think we have a question from the audience coming in. Just waiting for it. Question is, hello, in Washington State, we have observed how jail expansion happens through an interweaving of the criminal justice system with the mental health care system. How has this looked in your context? Question from Liam Montaigne. Does anyone want to speak to that? I'm going to quickly jump in and just say that and it's partially related to the earlier discussion we were having on carceral humanism. One of the justifications that has been used for building new prisons is kind of another way of saying the prisons being used as a panacea is this, in the Canadian context, is the changing offender profile. And what they're describing is that they're basically saying in previous decades, the prisoner population was homogeneous. Now it's heterogeneous. We increasingly have more people coming in with complex mental health issues, coming in with drug use issues, education issues, so on and so forth. And this concept has been invented as like, hey, here, the population's changing, so our prisons need to change, and they also need to be bigger to address crowding. And so what we're going to have is these spaces that aren't just going to be about simply imprisoning people. They're going to be spaces of healing, spaces of programming that are going to be culturally sensitive, that are going to be able to address mental health care needs, healthcare needs, and so on and so forth. So just a bit of a sense of some of the rhetoric that's being adopted here. And basically what we're saying is that the prisons can solve all the problems that we as a society haven't bothered to address properly with community-based supports. Anyone want to jump on this?
Well, I was
Intersection.
going to
Yeah, go ahead.
Just that, the excuse that the jail is now the largest mental health providing institution in X jurisdiction, I think is pretty common, and we're definitely seeing it ourselves locally. And that it is somehow, somehow the obvious solution to that, to actually create better mental health services with the money that they appear to be able to raise at the flick of a finger, it doesn't close the circle for them somehow. And I also just wanted to shout out to a very wonderful book that gives a bunch of new arguments against the new asylums argument, which is Liat Ben-Moshe's Decarcerating Disability, helping with a lot of these arguments. Highly recommend.
You're muted, Justin. I don't know if you were saying something.
Yeah, I was sorry. It has to just a reaction from Leah. It has to do with carceral humanism justification in Washington, but I think there's also a particular shift in the institutions that's resulted in the changes that in terms of how we have to fight, and I certainly agree with that. I don't know if others want to react to that, and then I've got another question that's come through.
Leah, tell us more if you want to. I know you can only do it through this chat function, but I'd love to hear more what you're thinking about, how it changes how we have to fight.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say this is not really an answer in the sense that is helpful, but that phrase that the jail's largest mental health provider, I don't know the origin of it, maybe people on this call do, but my understanding is that it's like I've heard sort of organizers use it against the jail often, of like, this is awful. And in Fulton County, which is most of Atlanta is in, our sheriff says that like positively. He's like, we're the largest mental health provider, and so I don't know if that's co-optation or what exactly the dynamic is there, but I mean, yeah, I think that there's like an acknowledgement of that, and they are using it as a justification to lean in even deeper. And I do think that Leah is exactly right, that like it changes how we have to fight. There have been efforts in Atlanta to, there's a couple of coalitions that formed, or one is more of a program called Policing Alternatives and Diversion. That's sort of, you can call people, you can call the 311 line and various service providers will show up. That's non-police. And of course, that's being attacked by the city. And then there is a coalition that formed, I think, called the Fulton Crisis Care Coalition, that is trying to expand, these mental health services throughout the county. But so I think that you're exactly right, that our methods have to reflect both the truth that it is the biggest. I mean, I don't think there's any real care occurring in these facilities, but that is the framing, and then I think that goes to needing to build the alternatives outside of it.
Okay, and I'm just going to read the comment from Leah. I only have a few characters I can type at a time. Fair enough. And so not only jail expansion, but complexification, the creation of new kinds of institutions, new kinds of entanglements between criminal punishment system and the behavioral health care system, circulation of beds between jail and behavioral health and prison systems. I certainly think that this is an important thing to bring up. And I know, one of the prisons that's being expanded is explicitly for in near me, St. Lawrence Valley and Correctional Treatment and Correctional Center. It's like they're expanding literally that wing of the prison to try and bring in mental health care, and yeah, we have to build our analysis and think through that. New kinds of prison facilities, Leah is saying, expanding mental health services that work hand in hand with the jail system. Yeah, it's a point of attack for sure. I've got another question from the audience. This one is from Sloan, and I'm trying to find it here. Keep thinking about the term abolition and the inaccessibility of that term for those who still support the larger movement. How do we render these so-called liberal woke terms in a way that brings all folks in? Do folks have thoughts about that? We've talked a lot about, working with, various kinds of allies that perhaps we didn't see ourselves working with when we maybe started engaging in this work. Unconventional ones, or ones that you would not normally come to mind. So I think we've spoken a bit about that in the session, but do folks have have a reaction to this question about how do we bring more folks into this broader movement. Anyone want to get started?
Well, one of the things one of the things that happened here in Bloomington was a reimagining public safety conference with this guy named
Matt Solomon,
yeah,
filmed by that name.
and there's this guy named Jody Armour, who's some lawyer from California. But you know, one of the things that I think that addresses this is this idea that we could spread out the services that we're getting from the carceral system, or unbundling instead of defunding, and we're unbundling some of these things that are just so taxing on the carceral system that we should move out to other areas. And you know, rather than, you know, abolition, you talk about unbundling these services from police, and I don't know if that addresses that, but that's what I thought of when the question came.
Mm. Yeah, but I also think that we have the reverse problem in that we have people who call themselves abolitionists who are totally fine with carceral expansion, and so that might be yet another reason not to, you know, reject the term, which I identify with deeply, but to use it sparingly or strategically.
I was going to say the same thing, Nicole. Just that it's I mean, on the one hand, it's such an important principled term to anchor us in a particular politics and tradition. At the same time, it's become so expansive in its application that I think it encompasses lots of political orientations and projects that actually aren't abolitionists. And so it's a fraught term. I'm personally not at all. I would never advocate sort of abandoning it. I think there's probably contexts in where it's actually still useful as a way to kind of identify or bring people in or push people or whatever. At the same time, I have this fond memory from when I lived in Bloomington and when we were fighting this project that Nicole mentioned before. At the time, that was called a Justice Campus. It was an earlier iteration of the same jail expansion proposal. And we were in this meeting, Nicole and myself and a bunch of other people, talking about this particular question. And Nicole, I hope it's okay that I tell this story, but you probably have no idea what I'm going to say. But Nicole herself was like, brought up this kind of like traditional, I think it's probably a Yiddish story about, you know what I'm going to say, about a mom trying to get her kid to eat a dumpling that in Jewish tradition we call a kreplach, which you know, might not sound appetizing, but in fact is delicious. But this kid was like, no, I don't want to eat this. This sounds awful, whatever. And the mom, to get her kid to eat the kreplach, just described each individual ingredient, which was of course delicious, right? So you have this yummy dough and you wrap up all this yummy other stuff. And the kid was like, oh yeah, it sounds great, you know? And so the point just being, of course, that like whether we use the term or not may not matter all that much, or maybe it matters in some contexts and not others, or maybe alienating in a lot of contexts. But I think for a lot of people, I think Micah was talking about this before, a lot of people can buy into the ingredients, and the ingredients of abolition resonate, I think, for most people. And so maybe it makes sense to think about in a lot of places, like speaking about those ingredients or highlighting some of them that are more or less relevant in a particular context. And maybe among some people, knowing that what we're talking about is abolition, but never necessarily needing to use that term.
Yeah, I mean, I'd really agree with what a lot of Judah said. A lot of our work is working with like rural white conservative communities that have found a prison being dropped on their head, right? And so, you know, I think for me, I've done a lot of trainings and conversations that we might classify as abolitionists with those communities, but the first one never uses the word abolition, right? For me, if I'm wearing my organizer hat, right, like my first and most foundational pillar of what that means is it's my job to meet the people where they're at and not where I want or expect them to be. And so if I'm thinking about that in regards to that type of like engagement within movement work in rural places or conservative places or with liberals are quite often much more difficult to deal with than conservatives. I'll be quite honest with y'all. It's I think a lot of the work that goes into that is emotions work, right? And it's navigating and holding space for emotion, whether it's in some of these initial conversations that could lead towards abolition or it's in sustaining the campaign long time. But I feel like when it comes to having conversations around these components that Jude is mentioning, you really got to get to the heart of like, what are the emotions underlying this reaction for these folks? And for me, when it comes to conservative audiences, right, it's, oh, well, I'm afraid of crime. And often it's like racially coded. And, it's all that, mixture of fear, right? That's the root emotion is fear. And so if we can begin to know that's the root emotion and unpack that slowly, we can say, oh, are you really afraid of crime or are you afraid of harm, right? And if you're afraid of harm to you, to your family, to your loved ones, well, let's look at how prisons actually reproduce harm, the very harm you're afraid of. And then from there, I found that a really like just breaking down those mental blockages and using that connection that grounds it in their emotion and honors their emotion, but then shows how actually the harm is being recreated and deepened by the carceral state. I found that a very helpful strategy to talk with conservative folks around ideas that we would classify as abolition.
Anyone else have thoughts on that question? Important question.
I have two quick ones. One, which I think just mirrors a lot of what's been said, and a little bit what I talked about before, is like I do totally agree that if you're knocking doors or talking to people in parking lots, which is a lot of what Stop Cop City canvassing has been, like it almost never makes sense to lead with like, are you an abolitionist or would you want to abolish prisons? Like that's just not going to be the way in. But I think there are so many concrete ways in of like, hey, do you know that this is happening in your neighborhood and how do you feel about it? And what does your neighborhood need and what does it not need? And it's been really cool to see residents, especially of the neighborhood around the forest that is at threat, talk about some folks have talked at public forums about how like they've called the cops for things before and they've been incredibly unhelpful and they don't want to have more cops in their neighborhoods. And so I think that the word abolition, I think is so important as like a guiding, as something that guides our orientation, but it's also like often the least important thing to say in in conversations with people. And then the second point that I have that I think that I feel like I used to be really pedantic about like saying abolition, and I still talk about abolition all the time. And also like talking to people like, is this the right word to use? Is it not the right word to use? Does it turn people off? And I think that's something that the last couple of years have taught me is like what turns people off one year can be a completely change the next year. I mean, even just the support for the burning of the precinct in Minneapolis, like shifts happen really quickly. And even this, the way that people interpreted or even knew of the term abolition, pre-2020 and post-2020 changed really rapidly. And so I think I've come to a place where I am trying to, never really get bogged down in the terminology, because the way, and not worry too much about terminology turning people off, because I think that things can just change so rapidly as conditions change, and especially as people take to the streets and, you do see, mass mobilizations and movements.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm just seeing if we have anything else coming from the audience. I'm going to fill the air for a few minutes while we see if anything else comes through. Just to recap in terms of some lessons that we can take forward. And I think this builds into the last question about like, do we use the term abolition? I think, Micah at the beginning of this second round here reminded us that abolition, it is a positive project. And we are articulating a positive vision for decarceral futures that's about housing for everyone, you know, healthcare and mental health care for everyone, education, better education. We can even be talking about things like parks and bike lanes and trying to make our communities safer and decentering carceral visions of safety. Safety is all those things that we need to survive and thrive, right? And that's not what police and prisons do. Full fucking stop. Refusal of that. And you know, Judah mentioned, you know, we need to point to what else we can build to address the material conditions that we have the prison being offered up as a solution to addressing, like providing jobs that people need to put food on the table and a roof over their head, to try and maintain rural infrastructure and healthcare, to try and maintain school enrollments, to help prevent an exodus of people from, you know, small towns that are dying because of deindustrialization and previous you know, capitalist formations. You know, we need to, well, I see other folks want to jump in. Maybe I'll let Nicole jump in, and I'm going to come back to some more lessons. Go ahead. I see a hand.
Yeah, no, I wanted to come back to, I don't know if this is going to be slightly out of sequence now, but I wanted to come back to the question that that Leah had asked by way of thinking about the broader panorama, because I think a lot of the times when we are fighting very specific jail fights, we're working on local institutions that might be allies and trying to build and buttress them, and that some of them themselves, we later understand, are in toxic collaborations with carceral systems. And we are coming more and more to see mental health care provision as one of those systems that is too often in cahoots with carceral systems. And one of the things that we've been seeing, thinking a lot lately with kind of native decolonial perspectives, are the ways in which the broader panorama of colonialism and racial capitalism are making us so sick. And it isn't, you know, we have to walk a line between insisting on winning this particular fight, which we do want to do, and building the institutions that will relieve us from the pressures that are genuinely making us sick and bad. And so I think mental health care is one, family policing is the other. We're pulling into our orbit and into our analysis increasingly some of the systems that we've sometimes seen as solutions to the prison industrial complex. For family policing, for example, we have suggested that you know, social work is an alternative to incarceration. And we're seeing increasingly how the fields of social work are enmeshed in prison building. And so I appreciate, Leah, your provocation, because I really, just in my local fight here, for example, I really want to push for the things that will make people healthy rather than the mental health care that is, you know, like once a week you get to talk to a counselor who's going to tell you to snap a rubber band around your wrist whenever you think a certain thought. But yeah, so I don't know, that's a kind of a question also about scale and holding two kinds of scale in mind, in hand, at any given time.
Really, really great points. And so at this stage, we have about 5 minutes left. I think audience questions, that's done for the moment. So what we'll do is each of you will get a final word, 30 seconds a minute, and then we'll end things off. I'm going to go in reverse order this time, if that's okay. Put you on the spot, Nicole and Lee. Do you have anything further you'd like to add as we finish off today?
Just said feels good to me as a last thing, and Lee is okay too.
Yeah, I really like the digging into the becoming the local expert is really helpful, because then you can shame the commissioners or the people who are elected who are supposed to know that. And I think that in that shame moment for them is a little bit of you know, they come out of their power position a little bit.
All right, thank you for that. We'll turn over to Judah.
Thanks. Yeah, so good to be in conversation with everybody. I love it. I'll say two quick things. One is one of the last lines of our book, of mine and Jack and Lydia's book, is something like, your local jail fight matters. It's at the center of the new geography of mass incarceration, or something like that. Just, I'm anticipating, like, okay, questions maybe like, how do we get involved? Like, what's the right campaign to spend time at, right? Like, this shit is almost certainly happening wherever you're watching this. So, getting involved there, it matters, and it's part of this very large center of this massive system. The other thing I would say, slightly in tension with that, is that I also think it's incumbent upon us that even as we become these local experts and struggle to really understand our local context and its specific historical conditions of its existence, that we also push ourselves to think about how it's in relationship to all these other things and all their own local specific context. So for us in the fight in Eastern Kentucky, like, how is our movement connected to Cop City? How is our movement connected to the fight against the Mountain Valley Pipeline, or up to Monroe County and in Bloomington, or for that matter, to Palestine? Like, I'm not pushing us to flatten out differences, but to also push our analyses to really be somewhat expansive as they also concentrate in to understand them locally.
Thanks for that, Judah. We'll move to Jack.
Hey, everybody. Not much to add. I would echo all of what Judah said, and thanks for having me here today. It's great to see everybody on Zoom. I hope to see many of you, maybe all of you, in person around the country in this next year. So thanks for everything. And yeah, free Palestine.
Thanks for that, Jack. We'll go to Jordan.
Yeah, I think I just want to end on really thinking through in terms of like the long-term resiliency of our movements. I really think it's entirely dependent on the interpersonal resiliency we have with our comrades in the struggle and with the people that we're organizing directly with, right? And I think it is entirely possible, even when facing down the most, traumatizing of institutions that carry a lot of trauma for those of us engaging with them and fighting them, right? I think it's entirely possible to do it in a way that is joyous, that is healing, and that through our very act of fighting all of these systems of power and oppression and devastation, we can create healing spaces within that fight. And so, I really just want to encourage folks to really, think through and center the abolitionist idea of accountability and think it through in terms of our daily praxis together, right? How are we being accountable to the people I'm working directly with? How are we being accountable to those most directly impacted by this situation? How are we being accountable to movements for liberation broadly, like Judah's referencing? How are we being accountable to, ourselves in this struggle, and really working through that together as a team to build a network of care that is also a network of fighting, right? And all in there.
Thanks for that, Jordan. Micah?
Yeah, I don't have a ton more to add. I'll just say that, obviously I've been, on the Cop City side of things. I think it's important to note that they are proposing cop cities in a lot of different places. And people are also fighting them in a lot of places. People are fighting Atlanta's cop city across the country. There are Weelaunee Defense Societies and chapters all over the place, which is so encouraging to me because of, even though it's a local project, the entities behind it are national and international entities that, people are fighting everywhere. And so, I think my closing words would just be, if you can fight Atlanta's cop city where you are, great. And if you can fight your cop city where you are, do that too. Thank you for having me.
All right, thanks for that. And thanks to all of you for taking part in this event on a long weekend and taking your time. As we've talked throughout this session, carceral expansion is happening in a lot of different places. It's happening in what has been called the criminal justice system, so in the context of policing and prisons, but it's also happening in other spheres that we've pointed to. And we can think about, cops in schools, we can think about, mental health care institutions and so on and so forth. That are opening up, and we also talked about immigration detention and so on, and all these things are being fought, right? And there are a lot of wins, right? And as Nicole and Lee mentioned earlier, the horizon is long, and we do win, but even when we lose, what we are doing is we're building a movement. We're developing, I think the words that were being used, non-state ways of relating to each other. We are building decarceral futures. And in doing that, we're reaching out sometimes to folks we never thought we would be working with, and we're radicalizing them, right? As they make us more attuned to conditions on the ground that we have to be attuned to and analyze and understand in order to fight better and win. And we keep pushing, we'll keep delaying until, you know, the abolitionist horizon is realized. I'm really grateful to you all for coming. I'm also grateful to Christine Schell, who's running the webinar here today on it is Saturday today, right? Is it Saturday? Okay. Who's taking time on the weekend to do this, and for ASA for making this space for us to have this conversation, and hopefully, not hopefully, we will have more conversations in the future. So thanks to you all. And yes, we're here online today because our session was originally canceled in the struggle for a free Palestine, okay, and liberation for everyone. All right, so we're going to be signing off now. Take care.